Updates from Russia's invasion of Ukraine now. Russia's Ministry of Defense said it destroyed an unmanned aerial vehicle that Ukraine had launched overnight to attack the Moscow region. In a statement on Telegram, the ministry said an attempt by Kiev to carry out a terrorist attack by an unmanned aerial vehicle on facilities in the Moscow region has been foiled. It also adds that the UAV was destroyed by means of air defense. The mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, also confirmed the attack. However, there were no casualties nor damage. Russian President Vladimir Putin says North Korea's firm support for Russia's war in Ukraine emboldens the two countries' determination to cope with Western groups. He made this known in a speech to North Korean officials on Thursday. Mr. Putin did not go into detail of the nature of Pyongyang's support in what he called Russia's special military operation. But U.S. officials said last year that North Korea was selling millions of rockets and artillery shells to Russia for use on the battlefield in Ukraine. The Russian leader said in his words, the historic experience of combative friendship has noble values and is serving as a reliable foundation to further develop the connection between Russia and North Korea in the field of politics, economy, and safety. Putin also wished North Korean leader Kim Jong-un health and achievement in his work for the well-being of his people. Meanwhile, North Korea's Kim Jong-un hosted a banquet to welcome the Russian delegation at a venue decorated with portraits of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Still photographs of the event released by the country's state news agency, KCNA, showed huge portraits of Putin featured on almost every wall. The Russian delegation, led by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, was in Pyongyang to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, which is celebrated in North Korea as Victory Day. Shoigu's visit was the first by a top defense official from Moscow since the 1991 breakup of the Soviet Union. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky visited a damaged cathedral in Odessa. The visit happened after Russian forces had struck a port infrastructure in an overnight missile attack, killing a security guard and damaging a cargo terminal. The president also paid a visit to a medical center in the city where Ukrainian soldiers undergo physical rehabilitation. The Ukrainian Presidential Press Service said Zelensky decorated military and civilian medical workers during his visit. Meanwhile, Mr. Zelensky also visited Dnipro in southeastern Ukraine to discuss the situation on the battlefield, supplies for troops, and how to strengthen air defenses. The Dnipropetrovsk region, an important economic center in southeastern Ukraine, is not far from the front line and borders Kherson in the south, Donetsk region in the east, and further north, Kharkiv region. It's day 2 of the Russia-Africa summit taking place in St. Petersburg. Speaking to a group of African leaders, Russian President Vladimir Putin says he respects the proposal for peace in Ukraine, which they put forward last month, adding that he would study the plan carefully. The Russian leader also said his country had written off $23 billion worth of debt to African countries, although he did not name the countries, nor did he specify the time period involved. African leaders were also told that Russia was interested in greater military collaboration. Mr. Putin also repeated Russia's position that it was ready for negotiations with Ukraine, but that Kiev was refusing to join them. Meanwhile, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is warning that a handful of donations won't correct the dramatic impact of the end of a deal that had allowed the safe Black Sea export of Ukraine grain for the past year. It comes after Russian President Vladimir Putin told African leaders he would gift them tens of thousands of tons of grain within months, despite Western sanctions, which he said made it harder for Moscow to export its grain and fertilizers.
It is clear that when taking out of the market millions and millions of tons of grains, it is clear that, based on economic laws, that will lead to higher prices, than the ones that would exist with the normal access of Ukrainian grains to international markets. And this increase of prices will be paid by everybody, everywhere, and namely by developing countries and by the vulnerable people in middle income and even developed countries. So it's not with a handful of donations to some countries that we correct this dramatic impact that affects everybody, everywhere. We need to be pragmatic. We need to do things that are possible. And we are doing every effort we can to guarantee the access of both Ukrainian and Russian food and fertilizers to global markets.
Secretary General Xu Dezhi with China Central Television.
Meanwhile, Yevgeny Prigozhin has been spotted in Russia. The Wagner Group boss was photographed in St. Petersburg during this week's Africa-Russia summit. He was seen shaking hands with Ambassador Freddy Mapuka, a senior official in the Central African Republic. The image was posted on Facebook by Dmitry Siti, who reportedly manages Wagner's operations in Kar. It is the first confirmed sighting of Mr. Prigozhin in Russia since Wagner's failed mutiny in June. As we've been reporting, Russia is currently hosting 17 African heads of state in St. Petersburg for a Russia-Africa summit. It is part of a concerted push to increase influence and business of Russia in Africa. Yesterday, during the first day of the summit, Russian President Vladimir Putin offered free Russian grain to 6 African countries. Russia has withdrawn from a deal that allowed the safe export of Ukrainian grain through Black Sea ports. Joining me now to talk about the Russia-Africa summit is DW correspondent Maria Sina in Berlin. Maria, I would like to ask you first, what's Russia's aim with this summit?
Well, the summit for Russia is really an opportunity to show that it is not isolated and can still do political business. Because if you consider Russia's position right now, it's sidelined by the West and by Western sanctions. There is an international arrest warrant out for Russian President Vladimir Putin. And internally, Russia is struggling with instability and a failed mutiny by the Wagner private army. So this summit means that Putin can flex his political muscle, and Russia is doing that by pushing a narrative at the summit as being a closer ally to Africa than the West is. And this grain gift rhetoric is a clear example of that. Now, another a point on the agenda for Putin certainly will be expanding the presence of the mercenary group Wagner in Africa. Right now, Wagner is propping up governments and exploiting minerals in countries like the Central African Republic and Libya. And that's a lucrative deal for Putin because it gives him more political influence in Africa and also more income. So that will certainly also be something that's on his mind during the summit.
Can African countries gain from the summit? Tell us a little bit about that.
One aspect that's very high up on the agenda for African leaders at the summit is food security. Countries like Ethiopia and Somalia are currently gripped by drought and hunger, and 80% of East Africa's grain is actually imported from Russia and from Ukraine. Now, this summit is happening 11 days after Russia opted out of the very grain deal that was feeding much of the continent. So African leaders certainly had high expectations for an alternative to this deal that was torn apart by Russia. Now, as you mentioned, Putin said that he will gift grain, actually up to 50,000 tons of grain, to 6 African countries. Now, the question is this gift really an alternative to a functioning deal? Because the kind of countries that will receive grain from Russia are countries like Mali and the Central African Republic, countries that are already allies of Russia, and not the countries that need it most right now, which are countries like Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. So really a big question mark here of whether this is actually the alternative that African leaders were hoping for. Now, otherwise, African leaders are also hoping to forge trade deals at the summit, of course. During the last Russia-Africa summit in 2019 in Sochi, Putin pledged to double trade with Africa. Now, that didn't happen, which has been disappointing, and it could also be a reason for why there are a lot of fewer African heads of state at this summit, just 17 compared to the 2019 summit, which had over 40 African leaders there. But certainly trade in the areas of education, tech and securities will be high up on the agenda for African leaders at the summit.
Marie, tell us, how is the summit being viewed in Germany and in Europe?
Quite critically, actually. So German Development Minister Svenja Schulze, right before the summit, called the summit a PR show by Putin. And she said that if Russia promises cheap grain for African countries on the one hand, but on the other hand bombs Ukrainian ports, the very Ukrainian ports that deliver this crucial grain to Africa, then its only aim really here is creating dependency. So very critical words from German Development Minister. And yesterday, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres also warned of these donations that were pledged by Putin, because he said that a handful of donations won't actually correct the dramatic impact of the end of a grain deal. So in Germany and Europe, politicians are wary of the rhetoric coming from Putin from the summit and are really seeing it as a PR stunt more than true cooperation.
All right, thanks very much, Marie. Appreciate having you on the program. That was our correspondent, Marie Sina, in Berlin.